The most foolish mistake we could possibly make would be to allow the subjugated races to possess arms. History shows that all conquerors who have allowed their subjugated races to carry arms have prepared their own downfall by so doing. Adolf Hitler. Good morning and welcome to another episode of the Liberty Dad podcast, a discussion on politics and culture. If you're tuning in live, I especially thank you for giving me your time so early. Man, what a quote to start things off with, right? I mean, go big or go home, something like that. There has been another shooting. And what happens after a shooting? Well, everybody that wants to restrict firearms rushes out to use it and starts making all sorts of claims and arguments. And so today I figured I would address some of those. So that's what we're going to do. And I think you're going to be enlightened. I hope so. I did my best. That's why I'm late for the show this morning. It's almost 7:30. I'm supposed to start the show at 7 and I'm late. And so hopefully today's lateness will be will give you value, right? The reason for me being late, hopefully that will provide you value. So let's see here, getting some things set up on the screen so that we can get going here. All right, get some logos and whatnot. All right, so what are we going to start with? Well, one of the first things that people like to talk about, one of the most, I don't know if it's the first or the most, but a very common one is people will resort to talking about the Second Amendment, and they'll say like, "Oh, the militia and well regulated and all this other stuff," and they'll start trying to interpret it. And as it turns out, we actually have a lot of information that I think people are going to be very surprised at, uh, that we're going to go over. But before I get to that, I want to lay out where libertarians come from when it comes to the Second Amendment. And it's actually not the Second Amendment per se. Okay. So I'm going to give you a crash course in libertarianism in like a minute or two. We start with the idea that you own yourself. Everything from there either submits or is in violation. Now, what does that mean that you own yourself? That means that I, DL, own this body and everything that it produces, I own as well. Okay. Now, if we're getting into an economic argument, then we start talking about my labor and all that. But let's back up. I own myself. Since I own myself, I can determine what happens to this self. I can determine if I want to, say, get in a boxing ring and fight somebody, or if I don't. I can decide if I want to put myself into a dangerous situation, or if I don't, or if I don't. I can decide if I want to defend myself or if I don't. Maybe I'm a pacifist, right? Maybe I'm somebody that says, under no circumstances whatsoever will I lift a finger to harm any person or creature. That is my right because I own myself. And if I can't do that, then I don't own myself. Now, if I choose to defend myself, then it stands to reason that I can defend myself using any tool that I wish. Therefore, I could use my fist, I could use a rock or a machine gun, right? Any of those are are left up to me because I own myself. This is where the libertarians come from. Now, when it comes to the Second Amendment, we look at the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, as a limit on government power, not a limit on people. And if you look and think about it, think about what Bill of Rights means. You hear this like, like food, like restaurant consumer bill of rights, and you'll hear things like what's another one? It's becoming kind of popular, like Bill of Rights for hotel guests and Bill of Rights for airline travel and Bill of Rights, like it. So this idea that you have a certain expectation that cannot be taken from you. And so the Bill of Rights enshrined what the government had a limit on, right? So you like they can't stop you from speaking. They can't stop you from practicing your religion. They can't force you to accept quartering of soldiers, right? You don't have to testify against yourself, and you have the right to self defense. These were all enshrined, and everything in there is a limit on government, not a limit on us. Now, through the years, through the many years, there have been a number of, the uh, the practice of law has a tendency to build upon itself, right? And that's in some sense what the Constitution itself did, right? It built upon English law. It differed in a way, but it built upon it. And then case after case after case tends to build. That's why when you read a court when you read a court document or a court ruling, you'll see that they reference other court rulings because they're like, look, this court over here, they said this. So because they said that and they found their reasoning based on some historical, other, thing, then we're gonna refer to this particular court ruling. And in some cases, they will dissent and say, hey, we think this court ruling got it wrong, right? And that happens as well. So this is kind of the basis of our law. And another basis of our law is that you have the right to um, due process. In other words, if the government is going to impede your rights, they can only do so if they do it, quote, fairly, right? This means maybe they can throw me in jail, but they can't just throw me in jail because, the neighbor said I did a thing. The neighbor says I did a thing. Maybe the neighbor says, "Hey, DL broke into my house and he stole my stuff and he kicked my child on the way out." Right. And so he goes and tells my neighbor might say this and go to the court. Well, the court can't just say, "Oh, well, we're going to throw you in jail because you did this." And you know, they have to go through a procedure. They have to give me due process. They have to evaluate the facts. Say, is this neighbor telling the truth? Are the facts as what's being said? Is it possible that somebody did break in and do all of those things, but it wasn't DL? Right. So this is what it means to have due process. So we're going to address some of these things, and then I'm also going to address common arguments. But I want to start right away with some legal stuff because I think the legal stuff is kind of fun. So we're going to start with this idea of militia, okay? Because a lot of people like to say, like, well, you can have a firearm, but you got to be in a militia, and that's totally meant that means the National Guard, okay? And so if you're not part of the National Guard, then you don't get to have a firearm. This is so common, and you can tell when somebody has done absolutely zero research. They didn't even do the most basic reading because they will spout that. And the problem with that is that is not at all what the term militia means, nor is it what the courts have found. Now, I let's be clear. The courts aren't always correct. Even courts admit that. Sometimes a court gets it wrong. Okay. But in order to determine whether or not a court has got it wrong, we have to read and we have to dig in and see what did that court say? What did a prior court say? What does history show? So we're going to do a little bit of that. So let me pull up on the screen. This is going to be DC versus Heller. And we're not going to read the whole thing because, I mean, goodness, it's 154 pages. Like that would be insane, right? To try to read that. So we're not going to do that. But we are going to take a look at something interesting regarding the militia that I think is a super duper value add. And it's going to arm you to better talk about what what the Constitution was referring to when it referred to a militia and what have the courts found. So let's pull that up on the screen right there. District of Columbia versus Heller. Now, let's go to the part where it talks, where they kind of talk about militia. Again, we're only going to read some snippets here, but I think it's going to be enough to make the point. I think you're going to get the gist of what the court ruling was. So we're going to go to page 47 here. Let me bring this back up on this on my screen so that I can see, and we will go to page 47 where, let's see, I've got it neatly highlighted right down here. We'll move it over just a wee bit to kind of get it centered on the screen. There we are. Perfect. So um, here's what they say. It was plainly the understanding of the post-Civil War Congress that the Second Amendment protected an individual right to use arms for self-defense. And then they say post-Civil War commentators. And again, this is on page 47 that you can find in the court ruling DC versus Heller. So here's what it says. Every late 19th century legal scholar that we have read interpreted the Second Amendment to secure an individual right unconnected with malicious service. The most famous was the judge and professor Thomas Cooley, who wrote a massively popular 1868 treatise on constitutional limitations. Concerning the Second Amendment, it said, among other defenses to personal liberty, should be mentioned the right of the people to keep and bear arms. The alternative to a standing army is a quote, regulated militia. But this cannot exist unless the people are trained to bearing arms. How far it is in the power of the legislature to regulate this right, we shall not undertake to say, as happily there has been very little occasion to discuss that subject by the courts. So in 1868, he wrote that up until then, there had been little discussion of this. Like it hadn't really been an argument. This is why the Supreme Court in DC versus Heller is going back to right to this particular point because he wrote in 1868 there hadn't really been any argument. Like it was pretty well understood, unconnected with malicious service all this time. Now you might remember that the Civil War ended in 1865, and the Second Amendment was ratified on December 15th, 1791. Yes, I'm cheating and looking at my notes. Get over it. I want to make sure I don't forget. So in 1790, so between 1791 and 1868, right, almost 100 years, nobody had really argued this point. Okay, and then after the Civil War, we get somebody who says, like, hey, it cannot exist unless the people are trained to bear arms. So it basically just means like you need to be trained. That's it. That's what it meant. You needed to be trained, and it was an alternative to a standing army. But it doesn't say that you can have one until there's a standing army. It just says like you can have one. Like you have this right. Period. End of story. So, but we're not done here because uh, DC versus Heller goes a little bit further. So we're going to go down and we're going to skip to the next page here. So we're on page 49 and it says all other post Civil War 19th century sources we have found concurred with Cooley. One example from each decade will convey the general flavor. Okay. So they cite three, um, three sources that agreed with Cooley about this. And they did it in the following the 3 decades following the Civil War. So here's what the first one says. The purpose of the Second Amendment is to secure a well-armed militia, but a militia would be useless unless the citizens were enabled to exercise themselves in the use of warlike weapons. To preserve this privilege and to secure the people the ability to oppose themselves in military force against the usurpations of government, as well as against enemies from without, that government is forbidden by any law or proceeding to invade or destroy the right to keep and bear arms. The clause is analogous to one securing the freedom of speech and of the press. Freedom, not license, is secured. The fair use, not the libelous use, is protected. J. Pomeroy, An Introduction to the Constitutional Law of the United States. This was in 1868. So there's a couple interesting things in here because it says the citizens were enabled, it would be useless unless the citizens were enabled to exercise themselves in the use of warlike weapons. So when people say, like, oh, this is a weapon of war, fine. back in 1868, it was pretty well agreed that the citizens could own and have warlike weapons. Right there. DC versus Heller. I didn't write this. This comes from DC versus Heller. And I don't have the notes on when DC versus Heller was, so I apologize. Um, which draws upon information post Civil War, which was understood for the prior 100 years. Okay, that yes, citizens could have warlike weapons, and we'll get to more on that in just a moment. And then it goes on and it says, and I like this part because a lot of people are like, well, you don't need an AR-15 to shoot deer. Maybe not. But again, here's what it says: to preserve this privilege and to secure to the people the ability to oppose themselves in military force. In other words, I need to be able to fight in a force equivalent to a military against the usurpations of government. Okay. As well as against enemies from without. In other words, they're saying right here that I have the right to have military like warlike weapons to fight against a government, my government, or enemies external to that. In other words, an invading force from, like, say, Canada, right? If the Canadian Mounties come rushing in, we have the right to defend ourselves against them every bit as much as we have the right to defend ourselves against our own government should it become tyrannical. And we have that right with warlike weapons. Then here's another part that I really like. It says, the government is forbidden by any law or proceeding to invade or destroy the right to keep and bear. So I like this: destroy or invade. Why those two words? Well, destroy is pretty easy, right? Like you can't get rid of it. But invade kind of means like to encroach, to come against it in any way, right? So they didn't just say like, hey, you can't take it away entirely, but they're also saying you can't diminish it as well. You cannot invade it. You can't destroy it. You can't take it away in its entirety. You can't take it away in part. Okay, awesome. So this was again written in 1868 and is pretty well established. And it goes through and it gives a couple more. So that one was 1868. And I guess since I'm here, I might as well read this one. It's not highlighted, but that's okay. As the Constitution of the United States and the constitutions of several of the states, in terms more or less comprehensive, declare the right of the people to keep and bear arms. It has been a subject of grave discussion in some of the state courts whether a statute prohibiting persons when not on journey or as travelers from wearing or carrying concealed weapons be constitutional. There's been a great difference of opinion on the question. Okay, so this is pertaining to states. And we're not going to get into the whole states' rights versus federal government, blah, blah, blah. But when it has been a discussion, it has been a discussion at the state level. And that was in 1873. And then they have another one here from 1880. Some general knowledge of firearms is important to the public welfare because it would be impossible in the case of war to organize promptly an efficient force of volunteers unless the people had some familiarity with weapons of war. Again, weapons of war. So it was saying back in the 1880s that, I mean, they make multiple reference in the 1880s, 1870, 1860. They understood weapons of war were permitted in the hands of the people, right? Now, a lot of people will argue and they'll say, well, DL, even Antonin Scalia, who is totally not a liberal, said that there could be limitations. Okay, well, let's address that. So, and that's also here. And see, where was that? Page 2. Let's go to page 2 here. So in their syllabus, they kind of have, this is what this is kind of like a summary of the ruling here, in case you didn't want to read all 154 pages. So here's what it says. This is Antonin, I believe this is Antonin Scalia writing. Like most rights, the Second Amendment right is not unlimited. It is not a right to keep and carry any weapon whatsoever in any manner whatsoever and for whatever purpose. For example, concealed weapons prohibitions have been upheld under the amendment or state analogs. The court's opinion should not be taken to cast doubt on long-standing prohibitions on the possession of firearms by felons and the mentally ill, or laws forbidding the carrying of firearms in sensitive places such as schools and government buildings, or laws imposing conditions and qualifications on the commercial sale of arms. Miller's, that's another court ruling, holding that the sorts of weapons protected are those, quote, in common use at the time, unquote, finds support in the historical tradition of prohibiting the carrying of dangerous and unusual weapons. Now, anybody that's familiar with any of this stuff knows that dangerous and unusual weapons is a phrase that comes about every so often, right? And this is where we get this idea that there could be some sort of limitation. Now, mind you, the way law works, it refers to prior law. Much of our law has referenced English law back in the day. So let's talk about that really briefly. So, as it turns out, there's a gentleman that, and I'm going to try to get this up on the screen while I'm talking, so bear with me here. There's a gentleman who wrote The Legal History of Dangerous or Unusual Weapons. His name is Clayton E. Kramer. Now, you might be like, who's this Clayton E. Kramer? Qualify this man. Like, tell me who he is and why I should listen to him. Well, as it turns out, Clayton Kramer is a historian, and that's primarily the value, but he does some other writings as well, and he's been cited by the Supreme Court on these kind of matters, right? On the matter of the Second Amendment. In fact, let me just read you. I'm not going to pull it up on the screen, but let me, where do we go here? Let me read you what his Wikipedia page says, just so that we get a good sense of who this man actually is and why we should maybe pay attention to him. Clayton E. Kramer from Wikipedia is an American historian, author, gun enthusiast, and software engineer. He played an important role early on in documenting errors in the book Arming America by Michael A. Belises, a book that was later proven to be based on fraudulent research. Interesting. His work was cited by the United States District Court for the Northern District of Texas in United States v. Emerson. His research also informed the Supreme Court decision in the Second Amendment cases of District of Columbia v. Heller and McDonald v. Chicago. So, in other words, he's influenced the Supreme Court in two different cases and the Texas State Court. Okay. So this is a man that if he says something, we should probably pay attention to. He's not just some armchair guy who did a little reading and thinks he knows what's up. He's a guy that has the credentials and is respected enough to be cited by Supreme Courts. So let's pull up what he had to say in this interesting 8-page article called The Legal History of Dangerous or Unusual Weapons. All right, where are we at? There we are. Here we go. Not going to read the whole thing, but I do want to highlight a few parts. And let's see. I think that's legible on the screen. Let's see. Maybe we can do a little bit better. Let's see here. I think. Well, give me just a second here. We'll try to make this a little bit bigger. I'm just going to leave it alone. I'm gonna leave it alone because if I don't, mess things up, and you're trying to pay attention, and I'm trying to do this. All right, abstract. I'm gonna read the abstract here. The phrase dangerous or unusual weapons has long been used by American courts to justify prohibiting possession or carrying of particular classes of weapons. Examination of the history of this phrase shows it was neither as ancient nor as broadly prohibitive as many assume. Analogies to First Amendment case law suggest that the authority of the government may be more limited than DC v. Heller, 2008. That's when it was, 2008, indicates. In other words, the man who influenced the Supreme Court in the case of DC v. Heller, which a lot of people cite as permitting the restriction of firearms, says that the authority of the government may actually be more limited than what the ruling in that case indicated. Interesting. So why would he say that? Well, let's go down and look. Let's see what he got here. All right. Under the precedential use of dangerous or unusual weapons, he says, for at least 2 centuries, American courts have used this phrase to justify prohibiting possession or carrying of some classes of weapons. But are all of these citations correct? Remember, I said that sometimes people get it wrong. So courts have ruled that another court has got it wrong. This happens. They are a reminder that secondary sources are never as trustworthy as primary sources. Most of these cases cite Blackstone and indicate the prohibition of, quote, going armed with dangerous or unusual weapons, end quote, comes from the Statute of Northampton in 1328. So this is again, we're referencing English law from the 1300s. And so you have this Justice Blackstone, and Justice Blackstone is the man. You may have heard the phrase, better 10 guilty, but better 10 guilty go free than one innocent be imprisoned. I'm kind of paraphrasing there, but that's basically where that phrase comes from. It's from Justice Blackstone. And so what this man is saying is that historically, when people use this idea of dangerous or unusual weapons to say, hey, past legislation, past legal precedent suggests that we can prohibit all this stuff. He's saying that they're relying on Blackstone, and that Blackstone citations may actually be inaccurate. Okay. All right, so let's go. Let's continue on here. And I didn't write down my page numbers, so I'm going to have to just scroll. So I do apologize for that, folks. I was rushing this morning. So we get to page 5. Now, this is only an 8-page document. I will have a link in the show notes, and I encourage you to actually look it up and read the whole thing for yourself. So under unusual weapons in the American experience. So in other words, what we're trying to establish is, what was it like back in the day when these words were written? Was it established? Was it understood that you could not have weapons of war? Well, as we just saw, DC versus Heller already says that after the Civil War, in the 3 decades following, that court cases were very clear and unambiguous. They even used the word weapons of war were permitted to be in the hands of civilians. So he goes on and says, what can be considered unusual weapons? Now, again, there's this phrase, unusual, dangerous and unusual weapons. And so he's identifying what's the history behind this. So, what can be considered unusual weapons in the context of the revolutionary and constitutional periods? Weapons that did not exist and were of a character or scale unimaginable to the framers might well qualify as unusual, such as nuclear weapons or fighter aircraft. But the range of weapons privately owned at the time is pretty breathtaking. Massachusetts passed a statute in 1789 which prohibited storing loaded weapons in buildings to protect, quote, the lives of those who are disposed to exert themselves when a fire happens to break out in Boston, end quote. In other words, what they're saying, if people need to get out of a building, this you cannot store loaded weapons in a place where people might have to rush out if there's a fire. Okay. The items which could not be stored, loaded, or presumably the sort of, the items which could not be stored loaded are presumably the sort of weapons that Bostonians kept. Quote, cannon, swivel, mortar, howitzer, or cohorn. I'm not even sure what a cohorn is. Hopefully somebody in the comments does. And elsewhere, the statute, firearms, bombs, grenades, and iron shells of any kind. In other words, the statute in Massachusetts in 1789 that prohibited storing weapons together, or loaded weapons, included cannon, swivel, mortar, howitzer, or cohorn, whatever that is, firearms, bombs, grenades, and iron shells, right? So, like, you were permitted to have them, but there was a limitation on how you could store them for the safety of people who needed to flee if there was a fire. Why? Because if there was a fire, it's basically a fireworks place catching on fire, but with ammunition. Okay. Significantly, while the statute prohibits keeping these weapons of mass destruction, because they were, as well as firearms loaded in houses, it does not prohibit carrying loaded firearms. So the statute at the time said, look, you can't store them loaded because if somebody's in a building, they might need to be able to escape without being harmed. But the statute didn't include any prohibition on carrying loaded firearms. So you could carry them. All right. And so then he goes on, he says, I'm just kind of make some snippets here. Loading a cannon with a canister shot made it into a tremendously powerful and long range shotgun. And he goes on a little further and he says, firing a cannon loaded with a canister shot in an urban environment would likely generate carnage that would dwarf any modern mass shootings. So, in other words, this historian who has been cited and influenced Supreme Court cases regarding the Second Amendment has written an article that suggests that while yes, there may be some limitations, it's actually probably not nearly as broad as the court has said. Because when you look back at history and you look at the time when all of these words were written and when people had firearms and freely carried them around, the restrictions were very few, while the weapons that they carried were actually quite dangerous. All right, let's see. I think that's it. Oh, nope, there's a little bit more here. Other indicators of what was considered a legitimate weapon for private ownership is the large number of blunderbusses that appear in news accounts and list of weapons seized by the British Army at the start of the Revolution. Now, a blunderbuss, if you're not familiar, that's the gun that comes and it kind of at the very end. I'm trying to think of the term that I want to use, but it basically trying to think of the word. I'm drawing a blank on the word that I want to use, but it kind of bows out. That's not really the term I want to use, but it kind of has this, it's narrow and it gets wider as it gets toward the end. All right. Blunderbusses with the characteristic belled muscle. That's the word I guess I should have just kept reading. With the characteristic belled muzzle were short range anti personnel weapons, putting an enormous quantity of shot in a broad pattern, the assault weapon of their day in terms of lethality and the number of persons that they could kill or wound. It's basically like a shotgun. Similarly, while most people assume that the machine gun is a very modern idea, the first machine gun was patented in 1718, the Puckle gun. Now, remember, 1791 is when they when they ratified the Second Amendment. So almost 80 years prior, they had a machine gun. It was already in existence. The Puckle gun, similar in concept to the Gatling gun of the Civil War. One was built and successfully fired in the rain, impossible for many conventional firearms of the time. Puckle guns were offered for sale in 1722. To say that automatic weapons were outside the imagination of the framers and therefore not protected by the Second Amendment is equivalent to arguing that modern electronic communications were beyond their imagination and therefore not protected by the First Amendment. In other words, they already had weapons at the time that could cause tremendous damage. I think that's it for my notes here on this particular. Okay, but I encourage you to read. I encourage you to look in the show notes and read this document in its entirety. There's some other interesting things in there. So, in other words, what Kramer is saying is that yes, at the time of the writing, they had machine guns and other weapons that could cause mass casualties, and they were allowed to carry them, even loaded. And the prohibitions that they had were very few, and they did not pertain to actual ownership or even carrying because they were allowed to carry them, right? And so when people make the argument and they say, well, you can't have, you shouldn't be able to have a machine gun because that's a military grade weapon, that doesn't comport with what DC versus Heller has said, nor does it comport with history, as indicated by Kramer, who, again, is a historian and influenced that very case. And he's written and argued that DC v. Heller might have went too far based on history. And again, our today's legal, what's law today is based on what was law yesterday and the day before in precedent. Okay, so that's a nice little summary that tells us a little bit about the issue of militia and about dangerous weapons. Like you could have a militia, it's very clear, unambiguous. Number two, you could have all sorts of extremely dangerous weapons because they did at the time. And that is very important because when people make this argument, they almost always try to go back and say, well, you couldn't have this because no, we have it's right there, black and white. You can read it for yourself. All right, so let's move on. Maybe there's some more that we can gain from here because you know what? I actually want to talk about a few other things really quickly. Here's another one. We're talking now. I did mention the idea of limiting, right? And that was in I think it was 1880. The court had ruled that you could not invade or destroy the Second Amendment, right? Somebody's right to self-defense, right? And I said that invade, destroy is very clear. You can't take it away in its entirety. Therefore, invade must mean take it away in part. But a lot of people will try to say, like, well, okay, you can have a firearm, but maybe you don't need that many bullets, right? Like there's no reason for you to have a 30 round magazine. Well, here's something interesting. If you go back and look in a little bit of history here, according to the New York Times in 2008, let me see, try to make this a little bit bigger so that I can see it just the way that things are here. All right. So in 2008, the New York Times did a report, 11 years of police gunfire in painstaking detail. New York City police officers fire their weapons far less often than they did a decade ago, a statistic that has dropped along with their crime rate. But when they do fire, even at an armed suspect, there's often no one returning fire at the officers. Officers hit their targets roughly 34% of the time. Now, if we're talking about a 10 round magazine, that means out of 10 rounds, if you're an officer and you're under duress, you're shooting at somebody, yeah, and this is when and frequently there's not even somebody returning fire, so it's not even that kind of duress, right? They're only hitting their target 3.4 times out of they would only hit their target with 3.5 bullets. So let's round it up to 4, right? So 4 bullets are going to hit their target out of 10 because the officers hit their targets roughly 34% of the time. Now, the presumption among many is that our officers are better trained. This is why officers should be allowed to have firearms and why the public should not, because the public is not necessarily well trained. I would argue with that. I know quite a few people who regularly go to the range and they regularly train to defend themselves, right? So they would probably be better than 34% of the time, even under duress if people were firing at them. But imagine a standard, let's say, housewife who has a firearm for self defense. Somebody breaks in the home and they're threatening her life. She's maybe upstairs taking care of the baby. She hears a break in downstairs. She rushes to the bedroom, grabs a firearm. She's concerned about her baby. She's concerned about who it is, how many there might be. She rushes downstairs, or maybe she doesn't, because that's actually not good practice. But whatever she does, she barricades herself to protect her baby. Um, and then somebody comes up the stairs and she fires at him. Right, all of that I would assume might put her in a position to need more than 10 rounds because her percentage of hitting her target would be lower than 34%. It might be in the 10s or the 20s, which means for every 10 bullets, she's going to hit that person one time. And what that means, it may not be the first 9, it may be the 10th one, right? And we're just basically using some math here to illustrate a point. When you're under duress, you might need more rounds in order to hit your target. Why? Because the circumstances may not lend. It's not like going to the range. I go to the range and I look at a target. I'm safe and secure. The people next to me are good people. I'm a good person. I've got a target, not a person that's trying to harm me. So this situation is well under control. I hit my target. Bam. I do great. I post a picture of it on the internet. Look how great of a shot I am. But that changes once things hit the fan. And so, therefore, if police can only hit their target 34% of the time, then it may be of value to recognize that civilians, some of them who are not as well trained, might need more ammunition in order to hit their target when their life is on the line. Now, it's interesting, and this is just a sad amusement here. When they fire at dogs, roughly 55% of shots hit home. So, what the New York Times said is the police are better at shooting your dog than they are a bad guy. All right, let's move away from that because we're not gonna hang on that one too much. All right, so now let's talk about some other Let's talk about some other things. So there's a Jon Stewart clip a while back, and he invited Nathan Dom, I think is his last name. He's an Oklahoma representative on his show, and he grilled him. Now, look, Jon Stewart's a smart man. Okay, let's not make any bones about it. He is a smart, intelligent individual. Doesn't mean he's always correct. And I think that Nathan kind of was ill prepared to deal to handle to defend himself in his position against Jon Stewart. So I'm going to try to do it on his behalf. Now, in fairness, I'm doing it from the safety of uh, behind this microphone, behind this camera, having advanced, opportunity to sit down and review what Jon Stewart said. So, in fairness to Nathan, he may not just been quick on his feet. Fair enough. But let's play a couple clips here and see what Jon Stewart says and what we can glean from that.
But you don't want anything that could help law enforcement or society determine whether or not a person is a good guy with a gun or a bad guy with a gun.
Most even
the
law
registry
enforcement
would allow you to have much more effective background checks.
Mhm.
So I don't understand why you won't just admit that you are making it harder for police to manage the streets by allowing all of these guns to go out without permits, without checks, and without background stuff. Why is that hard? Why can't you just stand by that?
Okay. Here's the problem. First and foremost, he's like, hey, look, you're making it harder for police by not identifying the good guys and the bad guys. So let's clear something up. Remember, at the very beginning of the show, I said that our legal system was based on due process. If you have mental illness, if you maybe tell your friend, like, man, I'd love to shoot up that school, you are not presently the bad guy, right? Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do anything necessarily, but we need to be very, very clear. You are not a bad guy until you are a bad guy, until you do something wrong. The idea that you register people in order to stop the bad guy from getting a gun means that you have to presume who is the bad guy from the very beginning. That's not how our legal system works, nor would that be a good idea. Remember, earlier I made this analogy like, what if my neighbor said DL wants to come in and break in my home because he made a joke about breaking in my home, and then the police come and they lock me up. Well, that's not due process. I may have talked about it and maybe I was planning on it, but I haven't done anything necessarily wrong yet. And if I made it via a joke, then it's even more unclear whether or not I'm actually a bad guy. This is very important. We cannot have a functioning society in the way that we want with freedom if we presume people are the bad guy before they've done something wrong. So the idea that you have this registry that is going to stop the bad guy from getting guns is absurd on its face. Furthermore, the actual bad guys, the people that will be bad guys, are more than likely to operate on the black market. So all you would be doing would be invading. Remember the word from earlier, invading or destroying one's right? You would be invading the rights of the people who would be willing to comply. That's all you're doing. In other words, you are only going to stop the good guys. You're going to prevent the good guys from having guns. That is an invasion of their rights, and it does not make people safer because it has not addressed who might actually become a bad guy, because you don't know who is going to be a bad guy. Now, you might be able to make the argument, and I think I would agree, that if somebody has a long history of writing about violence and they've got some mental illness, that they are predisposed to potential violence in the future. We may want to address that, and I have no issue having that conversation. However, we must start that conversation by saying this person is not yet a bad guy. We cannot treat people as bad guys who have not done anything wrong. That is how our system operates. Okay. That's where Jon Stewart is making this big mistake. He's presuming that we're going to stop the bad guy by assuming who is the bad guy. It doesn't work that way. All right, so let's look at something else here because the bad guy does bring up an interesting comment. And here's this comment here. And this is from Shannon Watts. She is I believe, the founder of Moms Demand Action. And she's talking about the event yesterday. And she said over 800 police officers. Let me pull this up so I can see it a little bit better here. All right. Over 800 police officers were at the parade today and over 1 million civilians who were allowed to be armed. Yet they couldn't stop a dozen people from being shot. More guns makes us less safe. This doesn't even make any sense. Here's why. Number one, all 800 police officers, and I'm assuming her numbers are accurate. All 800 police officers and all 1 million civilians were not at the specific place where the shooting occurred. They might have been in the vicinity, but they were not at the specific place. Think of it this way. Let's say I go to a busy shopping center and with my family, and we go into a restaurant at the shopping center, and a shooter comes in and starts shooting up the place. This would be the equivalent of saying, well, there were all those people at the shopping center and they couldn't stop him. That's not even realistic. It doesn't make any sense. The only people that you would need to concern yourself with were the people in the restaurant, in that immediate vicinity. The people that were somewhat close don't matter. So if you had 800 police officers and they're spread out all over the place and the shooting happens in a particular area, not all 800 police officers could even possibly respond because they're simply not close enough. Shannon is just making an absurd argument that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Second of all, the reality is that all you need is one person who has a firearm who is well trained. And then the question is, do they act? Not everybody will act. Some people may go and train, and then when things hit the fan, they may be caught off guard, or they may just simply find themselves too afraid. That's okay. No shade to anybody. But you cannot necessarily you cannot count every single person, be like, well, how come this person did? How come this person did? How come this person didn't? Therefore, we had all these guns, we couldn't make them safer. And to make the point, if she wants to say 800 police officers were in the vicinity and they couldn't stop it, well, then that's an argument. If over 1 million people are being used to say they were allowed to be armed and they couldn't stop a shooting, so therefore we need fewer guns, then the same argument, Shannon, applies to the 800 police officers. Well, if 800 police officers couldn't do it, then we don't need them either, right? Because what is good for the goose is good for the gander. So either it applies to both or it applies to neither. And I would say it applies to neither because the argument is absurd on its face. All right, let's get back to Jon Stewart because we got another clip here and I want to try to hurry up. Turns out being late means that I'm later to finish the show, but that's okay. I think it's a good show. I think we're doing pretty well today. All right, let's go.
I'll go you one further. You want to ban drag show readings to children.
All right, so I want to pause for just a moment here. Disregard the ban, the ban on drag shows. We're just going to use what he says later in a moment. But I wanted to play this whole clip so that it kind of made sense. So just kind of disregard that. We're not going to talk about drag show bans, but it is kind of relevant.
Why?
Yes.
Why?
Why?
What are you protecting?
Why can we prohibit children from voting? Those under 18 from voting.
Why are you
But also
banning
that
is that free speech? Are you infringing on that performer's free speech?
they can continue to exercise their free speech, just not in front of a child.
Why?
Because the government does have a responsibility to protect.
I'm sorry?
The government does have a responsibility.
So this is where he gets himself in trouble. But again, we're not going to address that. We're going to address Jon Stewart's comments in just a moment here.
In certain instances, to
What's the
protect children.
leading cause of death amongst children in this country? And I'm going to give you a hint. It's not drag show readings to children.
Correct. Yes.
So what is it?
I'm presuming you're going to say it's firearms.
No, I'm not going to say it like it's an opinion. That's what it is. It's firearms. More than cancer, more than car accidents.
Okay, so he says it's firearms. Well, that's actually kind of dubious. Why is it dubious? Because when you look up the facts, it's interesting when you read a study, because when you read a study, you'll find that they define things in a particular way that you may or may not agree with. And in this particular case, we're talking about kids. How, what is the leading cause of death among kids? So let's take a look and see what one study actually said. So let's look at this. I believe that's what we want. Let's put this up on the screen. Okay. And where are we here? Okay, perfect. I think I've just about got it ready here. All right. So this is a study that's referencing some CDC data. And we're not going to read the whole study. I'm just going to cite it a little bit for you. And why does it seem so kind of, let me move this around a little bit. Apologize for that, folks. Let's see here. All right. That's kind of weird looking how it kind of ended up. Let me see if I can't quickly try to adjust it a little bit here so that it looks a little bit normal. Um, let's see here. Let's try that. And then, oh, there we go. I see what I did wrong. I moved it a little bit too much. There we go. Okay. Almost got it, folks. I do apologize for this. Turns out that I didn't size it correctly so that it would fit properly on the screen. There we go. And let's see here. There we go. All right. How about that? That looks much more better. All right. So this is a document. This is it says current causes of death in children and adolescents in the United States. And so this is from the New England Journal of Medicine. And this is in May 19th of 2022. So it's relatively recent. So what I want to do is I want to show you some of the snippets of what it says. So let's pull that up on the screen here really quickly. We're going to hone in on a couple of things that it says right there at the very beginning. All right. So here, this is what it says. Given that firearm homicides disproportionately affect younger people in the United States, these data call for an update to the findings of Cunningham et al. Regarding the leading causes of death among U.S. children and adolescents. So I want you to focus on what does it mean to be a children? How do we define children and adolescents? Well, as it turns out, this study tells us. So let's take a look at the next image here. So the next image points out and says that the leading cause of, it says, as the leading cause of death among children and adolescents, defined as persons 1 to 19 years of age. That's a huge problem. Why? Now, when you're 18 or 19, you are not necessarily mature, but you are an adult. You are no longer a child or adolescent as understood by the general population. So this is, you might think of this as kind of like an asymmetry of understanding of definitions between people who wrote the study and everyday average people. Because if I walk up to somebody and I say, is an 18 or 19-year-old person legally, or are they a child or adolescent? Virtually everyone's going to say no. If I ask, is this person mature? They'll say also probably no, or they might kind of give a nuanced answer and say, well, they could be, they might not be. It really depends on the person, which I would agree with. Here's the big problem with that. When you become 18, you can take out college loans, you can buy a house, you can buy a car, you can enter in any legal contract, right? And I don't know that you can smoke anymore, but you used to be able to, right? But you can also join, and you can join the military, and you can go to, in fact, you're required if you're a male to sign up for this selective service, but you can join the military and potentially be shipped off to war at age 18 or 19. Actually, you can sign up before age 18 or 19. So as of 18 or 19, you are legally an adult. You can be tried in a court of law as a legal adult. There is no, unless you maybe have some mental incapacities, you are tried as an adult, not as a child, not as an adolescent, right? You are treated entirely differently. If a 40-year-old man hooks up with an 18-year-old male or female, we might think it's gross, which it is, but it's not illegal. They have not committed a crime because the person's of legal adult age to consent. They can consent to the military. They can consent to all manner um, of assigning legal contracts, whether that puts them in massive debt or what have you, right? Like they are considered a legal adult. So it doesn't make sense to include them when we're talking about the leading cause of death among children and adolescents. To further illustrate my point, let's go back to something from the internet, from the CDC. Where is it here? So this is drowning facts. And I want to make this point. Go back to it here. Where are we? There we are. All right, perfect. So let's take a look at what this is. And I'm going to try to zoom in on this a little bit so that you can see it a little bit better. All right, perfect. Drowning facts. Drowning is a leading cause of death for children. Okay. In the United States, more children ages 1 to 4 die from drowning than any other cause of death. For children ages 5 to 14, drowning is the second leading cause of unintentional injury death after motor vehicle accidents. Well, isn't that interesting? They're defining child here as between 1 and 14. They didn't say children and adolescents 1 to 19. When we talk about children and adolescents in other contexts, we don't have this huge group lump of 1 to 19, but we do it when it comes to firearms. And why is that? Well, because everybody loves children. I love my son. He's awesome, right? And I think children are great. And so children tug at our heartstrings. And so this is a nice way to emotionally try to capture people by saying, well, the leading cause of death among children is firearms if it's 1 to 19. And we haven't even gotten into whether we're talking about homicides or suicides. Like some 30% of firearm deaths are suicides. Well, that represents an even bigger problem because if 30% are of those deaths are suicides, the problem is a lot less the death part. It's the part that they wanted to commit suicide and they happen to have found a firearm. But there are other ways to commit suicide. And maybe they choose to use those and maybe they don't. But the point being is that when they say the leading cause of death among children, kids, children and adolescents, whatever they want to talk about, the statistics that they use are not used in the same way that we use other statistics. They use them in a way that emotionally pulls on us and it's deceiving. And we need to call people out on it. All right. A couple more things here and then we can wrap this up. So let's see here. Where is it? Is that it? Let's see here. Yeah, I think that was it. I thought I had something else. Did I not have something else? I thought I had something else. Maybe I didn't. Maybe that was it. Okay. I think that was it. That's all the material I got. I hope this addresses a lot of the arguments that are going to be coming out today. So just a recap. All right. We'll do a quick recap really quickly because then I got to get going here. Family needs me. All right. So if people want to say it's the militia, no, it's not. 1860, 1870, no, I'm sorry, 1870, 1880, 1890, the US courts already had agreed that people could have weapons of war, period. End of story. Like they agreed and there's documentation that says for the past 100 years prior, since the time of the Second Amendment being ratified, that it was not in dispute. That was not an argument that was being had, right? And so the idea that you could have all manner of weapons was acceptable and you could carry them, right? Second of all, when people talk about, hey, well, maybe we need to limit these kind of firearms because the case DC versus Heller, that kind of suggests it does. Well, the man who influenced DC versus Heller and a historian, along with other court cases related to firearms, goes back in history and points out where actually it appears that while, yes, there is legal precedent to put a limit on firearms, it's not nearly as broad as DC Heller indicated, and it's definitely not nearly as broad as gun grabbers would have you believe. Then we go on and we say, well, what about limiting, like, say, bullets and stuff like that? If we know that police hit their target only 34% of the time, unless it's a dog, which is 55% of the time. But if they only hit their target 34% of the time, then that means that somebody who's maybe not had nearly the amount of training, presuming they actually get it, of a police officer, they may need more rounds because they may be in a situation where they're under duress. The idea that if 800 people, 800 police officers are in a particular given area and they couldn't stop a shooting is not an argument for disarming people. Because if it's an argument for disarming people because a million people were there and they couldn't stop it, then it's an argument also for disarming the 800 police officers. So it's either both or none at all. And I would argue it's none at all. The idea that children, the leading cause of death for children is firearm shootings. That's only true if we're counting people that we would otherwise, in other contexts, not consider to be children. So it's a deceiving argument, plain and period. And when we look at other data, we see that they actually don't go up to 1 to 19, or they infrequently do. I'm sure that somebody could find a study that references something that does include 1 to 19 or some ages along that line. But in general, the population does not look at children and adolescents as being ages 1 to 19. The law technically does not either, because once you cross over that threshold to 18, things change for you. You can be tried as an adult. You will be tried as an adult because you legally are an adult. You can sign and go to college and assume $200,000-300,000 worth of debt. You can buy a home, you can buy a car, you can sign up for the military, and we allow an 18 or 19-year-old to sign up for the military, go over to another country, carry a firearm, a gun, a weapon of war, and shoot other people in some other country. But then we're going to turn around and say, oh yeah, that person's a child or adolescent. So what are you trying to say? Are you saying that we are sending children and adolescents to war? Is that what you're saying? Because I think the gun grabbers really need to have a reconciliation with some of their own arguments. And then lastly, the idea that we cannot defend ourselves falls afoul of the libertarian argument because you own yourself. And if you own yourself, you can choose to defend yourself or not. I don't have to defend I could go downstairs right now, walk outside, be attacked by somebody, fall down on the ground, curl up in the ball, get kicked in the back repeatedly until I'm put in the hospital. Now you might say, DL, if you do that, you're a fool. I would agree, but it's my right. You can't stop me. And you can't stop me also if I choose to defend myself by grabbing a rock and smashing the perpetrator in the face. You also can't stop me if I happen to be carrying, whether that's a 9mm pistol or an AR-15, right? You can't stop me. And I'm talking about in principle here. You can't stop me because I own myself. So therefore, I have the right to self-defense, which means I have the right to choose how I defend myself or if I do at all. All right. I'm gonna try to get a couple comments here because I know there's some comments in here. Let's get to some comments. And then I'm going to get out of here because, man, am I behind. Let's see. Let's see here. These clowns use books like Lying with Statistics to prove their point. Absolutely. I encourage people to look up how statistics can be manipulated. So easy, and it's done all the time. Let's see here. I appreciate you, DL, Keith, and everyone that's watching. I appreciate you guys as well. Thank you for tuning in, but it is definitely time for me to go. I want to thank you for watching, and I hope you found this episode informative and inspiring. I want you to be sure to catch me Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. ish, for an informed discussion on politics and culture. And then again, Sundays, 7 p.m. with my co-host, Susan Hogarth, to discuss LP happenings. We go out and we find what's going on in the Libertarian Party in different states. We compile the information together and we let you know to the best of our ability what they're up to so that you can be inspired and excited about the Libertarian Party. Make sure that you are subscribed to my YouTube channel, or if you prefer, my Rumble channel. You can go to youtube.libertydad.com or my Rumble channel, rumble.libertydad.com. Please drop me a comment. Let me know how I'm doing. And lastly, I want you to remember, if you are a champion of liberty, then your business is people and your product is liberty. I want you to have a great week. I'll catch you next time. Because right now, I'm out.